If you stand today at the entrance of the British Museum in London, you will see the grand columns of empire. You will see the Rosetta Stone stolen from Egypt. You will see the Parthenon marbles taken from Greece. The museum is a monument to a time when Britain could simply take what it wanted from any corner of the globe, and no one could stop them. For over a century, the British Empire was the undisputed master of the world. The Royal Navy patrolled every ocean. The sun never set on British territories, and at the heart of this empire, like an artery pumping the lifeblood of trade and power, was a thin strip of water in the Egyptian desert, the Suez Canal. We are taught that the British Empire ended gracefully. We are told that after World War II, Britain simply decided to give independence to its colonies out of a sense of fairness and democratic progress. We are told that the transition from the British world order to the American world order was a smooth handover between friends and allies. But there is a different version of this story. It is a version that is remembered with humiliation in the corridors of Whitehall and with triumph in the boardrooms of Wall Street. In this version of the story, the British Empire did not retire gracefully. It was destroyed. It was humiliated in front of the entire world by its own supposed ally. In the span of just 6 days in November 1956, the United States of America pulled the rug out from under the British lion and exposed it as a toothless old cat. The instrument of this destruction was not a nuclear weapon or a military invasion. It was something far more devastating. It was the power of the dollar. This is the story of the Suez Crisis. It is the story of how Britain launched its last imperial war and how America crushed it with a phone call. It is the story of the day the world learned that there was a new sheriff in town and his badge was printed by the Federal Reserve. To understand this humiliation, we have to understand what the Suez Canal meant to the British Empire. The canal is a 120-mile-long artificial waterway that cuts through the desert of Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Before it was built, ships traveling from Europe to Asia had to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa, a journey that took months and was incredibly dangerous. The canal reduced the journey by thousands of miles. It turned a months-long voyage into a matter of days. The canal was completed in 1869, built by a French engineer named Ferdinand de Lesseps using Egyptian labor and Egyptian money. But within a few years, the British had taken control of it. In 1875, the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli pulled off one of the great financial coups of the 19th century. The Egyptian ruler, Khedive Ismail, was drowning in debt. He had spent lavishly on palaces and wars, and he desperately needed cash. Disraeli learned that the Khedive was willing to sell his shares in the Canal Company. Working in secret, Disraeli borrowed £4 million from the Rothschild banking family and bought the Egyptian shares before anyone else could bid. Overnight, Britain became the largest shareholder in the Suez Canal Company. The control of the canal gave Britain an unparalleled strategic advantage. It was the jugular vein of the empire. Through the canal flowed the oil from the Persian Gulf that powered the British economy. Through the canal traveled the merchant ships that connected Britain to India, to Australia, to the Far East. The Royal Navy maintained a massive military base on the banks of the canal. At its peak, over 80,000 British soldiers were stationed in the canal zone. It was not just a piece of infrastructure. It was the symbol of British power in the Middle East. But by the 1950s, the world was changing. The British Empire was collapsing. India had won independence in 1947. Palestine had been abandoned in 1948. The colonial holdings in Africa and Asia were demanding freedom. Britain was exhausted. The Second World War had bankrupted the country. The economy was in ruins. The pound sterling, once the dominant currency of global trade, was weak and constantly on the verge of devaluation. Britain could no longer afford to police the world, but the British elite refused to accept the new reality. They clung to the fantasy that Britain was still a great power. They believed that if they could just hold on to a few key assets, like the Suez Canal, they could maintain their influence and prestige. The conservative government of Prime Minister Anthony Eden was particularly obsessed with this illusion. Eden had spent his career as a diplomat in the glory days of empire. He could not accept that the age of British dominance was over. And then, in 1952, a man came to power in Egypt who would shatter that illusion forever. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was a colonel in the Egyptian army who led a coup that overthrew the corrupt monarchy of King Farouk. He was a nationalist, a socialist, and a visionary who dreamed of a modern, independent Egypt free from the control of foreign powers. He was young, charismatic, and wildly popular with the Egyptian people, and he hated the fact that a vital piece of Egyptian territory, the Suez Canal, was controlled by European colonialists. Nasser's rise terrified the British. He represented everything they feared: a confident, educated Arab leader who refused to bow to Western demands, a man who spoke of Arab unity and anti-imperialism, a man who was willing to play the Cold War superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, against each other to get what he wanted. The British and French governments began to view Nasser the way they had once viewed Hitler. They called him a dictator. They said he was a threat to peace. In their minds, if they did not stop Nasser, he would inspire every other colony to rise up and throw off European control. The crisis came to a head in the summer of 1956. Nasser had a grand plan to transform Egypt's economy. He wanted to build a massive dam on the Nile River, the Aswan High Dam, that would control flooding, generate electricity, and irrigate millions of acres of farmland. It was a project that would cost over $1 billion. Nasser had negotiated a deal with the United States and Britain to help finance the dam. But at the last moment, the Americans and British pulled out. They withdrew their offer of funding as a punishment for Nasser's refusal to join Western military alliances and his flirtations with the Soviet Union. Nasser was furious. He had been humiliated in front of his people. He had promised them a modern Egypt, and the West had slapped him in the face. On July 26, 1956, Nasser stood in front of a massive crowd in Alexandria and delivered a speech that would change history. He announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal. He declared that the Canal Company, which had been owned and operated by British and French shareholders, was now the property of the Egyptian state. The revenues from the canal, which had been flowing into European bank accounts for decades, would now be used to fund the Aswan Dam. The crowd erupted in celebration. For the Egyptians, it was a moment of liberation. For the British and French, it was an act of war. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was in a state of rage. He called Nasser a thug. He said that Britain could not allow a vital waterway to be controlled by a hostile dictator. He compared the nationalization to Hitler's annexation of the Rhineland. He believed that if Britain did not respond with force, the entire empire would unravel. The French government, led by Prime Minister Guy Mollet, shared Eden's fury. France was fighting a brutal colonial war in Algeria, and Nasser was supporting the Algerian independence fighters. The French wanted Nasser destroyed. In secret, the British and French governments began planning a military operation to seize the canal by force. But they faced a problem. They could not simply invade Egypt without a pretext. The world had changed since the 19th century. There was now the United Nations. There were international laws. If Britain and France were seen as the aggressors, they would be condemned by the global community. They needed a cover story. They needed someone else to start the fight. They found their partner in Israel. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, had its own reasons to hate Nasser. Egypt had been blockading Israeli ships from using the canal. Egyptian-backed guerrillas were launching attacks across the border. Israel wanted to strike a crippling blow against Egypt, but it also feared that attacking alone would bring the wrath of the Arab world and the Soviet Union. The British and French offered Israel a deal. If Israel invaded Egypt, Britain and France would pretend to intervene as peacekeepers to separate the two sides. In reality, they would use the conflict as an excuse to seize the canal. It was a conspiracy worthy of a spy novel. The leaders of Britain, France, and Israel met in secret at a villa in Sèvres, France, in October 1956. They drafted a plan. Israel would attack Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum demanding that both sides withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Egypt inevitably refused, the British and French would invade, overthrow Nasser, and retake the canal. They called it Operation Musketeer. They were confident it would work. They believed they could present the world with a fait accompli. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the canal would be back under Western control and Nasser would be gone. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They did not tell the Americans. President Dwight Eisenhower and his administration were kept completely in the dark. This was not an accident. Eden knew that the Americans would oppose the plan. Eisenhower was an anti-colonialist. He believed that the age of European empires was over and that the future belonged to independent nations allied with the United States. He had spent years trying to win the support of the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa. An Anglo-French invasion of Egypt would destroy all of that goodwill. It would make the West look like a gang of imperialist thugs. Eden gambled that if he moved quickly, he could conquer Egypt before the Americans could stop him. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces stormed across the border into Egypt. They moved with stunning speed. Within days, they had crushed the Egyptian defenses in the Sinai and were racing toward the canal. On October 30, as planned, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. They demanded that both Israel and Egypt withdraw their forces from the Canal Zone. It was a sham. Israel, which had been miles away from the canal when the fighting started, gladly agreed. Egypt, which owned the canal, refused. Nasser called the ultimatum an insult to Egyptian sovereignty. On October 31, British and French bombers began pounding Egyptian airfields. They destroyed Nasser's air force on the ground. On November 5, British and French paratroopers dropped into the Canal Zone. Thousands of troops landed on the beaches. They quickly overran the Egyptian positions. The Egyptian army, poorly trained and equipped, was no match for the modern European forces. Within hours, the Anglo-French coalition had seized control of the northern end of the canal. It looked like the operation was a success. But while the British and French soldiers were advancing through the Egyptian sand, a financial storm was brewing in London and Paris. The United States was furious. President Eisenhower felt personally betrayed. His closest allies had lied to him. They had launched a war without his knowledge during the final week of the U.S. presidential election. Eisenhower believed that the invasion was immoral, illegal, and strategically insane. It was handing the Soviet Union a propaganda victory. While the West was condemning Soviet tanks crushing the Hungarian uprising, Britain and France were doing the exact same thing to Egypt. Eisenhower decided to destroy the invasion, but he did not send the U.S. military to stop the British and French. He did not need to. He had a far more powerful weapon. He had the dollar. The American strategy was brilliantly simple. They would strangle the British economy until the government collapsed or withdrew from Egypt. The execution of this financial warfare was ruthless and precise. The first strike came in the currency markets. The British pound was already weak. Britain's economy was fragile. The government was running a massive trade deficit. To maintain the value of the pound, the Bank of England needed large reserves of gold and U.S. dollars. As soon as the Suez invasion began, currency speculators around the world began to dump pounds. They knew that a war would drain Britain's reserves. The value of the pound began to collapse. In a matter of days, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars in reserves trying to prop up the currency. Normally, in a crisis like this, Britain would turn to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. The IMF had been created after World War II to help countries facing balance of payments crises. Britain was one of the largest members of the IMF. They had every right to request assistance. But the United States controlled the IMF, and the Eisenhower administration made it clear that if Britain wanted American money, They would have to get out of Egypt first. No withdrawal, no loan. It was blackmail on a global scale. The second strike came from oil. The Suez Canal was not just a British obsession. It was vital to Europe's oil supply. Most of the oil from the Persian Gulf traveled through the canal to reach European refineries. When the fighting began, Egypt blocked the canal by sinking ships in the waterway. At the same time, Arab countries, furious at the British and French aggression, began cutting oil shipments to Europe. Pipelines were sabotaged. Oil exports were halted. Within days, Europe was facing an energy crisis. Gasoline prices soared. Factories began to shut down. There was panic about winter heating fuel. Britain desperately needed oil from other sources, particularly from the United States. But Eisenhower refused. He would not allow American oil companies to increase exports to Britain. He would not release oil from the U.S. Strategic reserves. He made it clear that if the British wanted American oil to keep their economy running, they would have to withdraw from Egypt. Once again, no withdrawal, no oil. The third and most devastating strike was diplomatic. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session. The Soviet Union, which was delighted to see the West tearing itself apart, demanded that Britain and France withdraw immediately. For once, the United States agreed with the Soviets. The American delegation introduced a resolution condemning the invasion. It was an extraordinary moment. The United States was voting against its own closest allies. When Britain and France used their veto power to block the resolution in the Security Council, the issue was moved to the General Assembly. There, in front of the entire world, the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to demand a British and French withdrawal. The vote was 64 in favor, 5 against. Britain and France were isolated and humiliated, but the diplomatic humiliation was just theater. The real pressure was economic. By mid-November, the British government was in a state of panic. The pound was in free fall. The reserves were nearly exhausted. The oil shortage was crippling the economy. The Treasury warned Prime Minister Eden that Britain was on the verge of financial collapse. They had weeks, perhaps days, before the country would run out of money to pay for essential imports. Britain would face the same fate as a third-world debtor nation, bankrupt and at the mercy of foreign creditors. Eden called Washington and begged for help. He pleaded with Eisenhower to release the IMF loan to allow oil shipments to stop the financial bleeding. Eisenhower's response was cold. He told Eden that the United States would not lift a finger to help until British troops were out of Egypt. There would be no negotiations, no compromises, no exceptions. Withdraw or collapse. Those were the only options. On November 6, just 1 week after the invasion began, the British cabinet met in a state of desperation. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, who had been one of the strongest supporters of the invasion, delivered the devastating news. He told the cabinet that Britain could not survive without American support. The reserves were gone. The pound was collapsing. If they did not withdraw immediately, the currency would have to be devalued, imports would halt, and the economy would spiral into depression. It would be a disaster worse than the war itself. Eden had no choice. He was a broken man. His health was failing. He was addicted to painkillers after a botched surgery. He had gambled everything on the Suez operation, and he had lost. On November 7, Eden announced a ceasefire. British and French forces would withdraw from Egypt. The invasion was over. Nasser had won. Britain had lost, and the entire world had watched. The consequences of the Suez Crisis were immediate and catastrophic for Britain. Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace in January 1957. His reputation was destroyed. He is remembered today not as a statesman, but as the man who led Britain into its greatest post-war humiliation. The British military withdrew from the Canal Zone, and Egyptian forces took control. Nasser was not overthrown. Instead, he became a hero across the Arab world. His successful defiance of the old colonial powers made him the symbol of Arab nationalism and Third World resistance to imperialism. But the deeper consequence was the exposure of British weakness. For over a century, the world had believed that Britain was still a great power. The Royal Navy, the British pound, the prestige of empire. All of it created an illusion of strength. The Suez Crisis shattered that illusion. It revealed the truth. Britain could not act independently. It could not even defend its own vital interests without American permission. The empire was not just declining, it was already dead. It was a corpse being held upright by American life support. The financial humiliation was particularly brutal. The United States had demonstrated that it could destroy the British economy with a phone call. Britain's currency, its trade, its access to international credit, all of it depended on American goodwill. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for 100 years, was now just a regional currency propped up by the dollar. Britain had become a client state. The special relationship between Britain and America was revealed to be a relationship between master and servant. For the United States, the Suez Crisis was a triumph. Eisenhower had established the new rules of the game. The old European empires were finished. America would not allow Britain and France to drag the West into neocolonial wars. The future belonged to a world order shaped by Washington, not London or Paris. Eisenhower used the crisis to position the United States as the leader of the free world, a benevolent superpower that opposed imperialism and supported the independence of new nations. It was brilliant propaganda, even if the reality was more cynical. But the Suez Crisis also taught the United States a valuable lesson. Military power alone was not enough to dominate the world. The real power lay in control of the global financial system. The Americans had crushed the British invasion without firing a single shot. They did it by controlling access to dollars, to IMF loans, to oil markets, to international credit. This was the weaponization of finance. It was a form of warfare that left no bodies in the streets, but could bring even the greatest empires to their knees. In the years that followed, the United States built on this power. The dollar became the undisputed global reserve currency. The Bretton Woods system, which had been created after World War II, gave America control over the institutions of international finance. The IMF and the World Bank became instruments of American foreign policy. If a country wanted access to global markets, to international loans, to stable currency, they had to play by American rules. And if they refused, they would be cut off, isolated, and economically destroyed, just like Britain had been in 1956. The legacy of the Suez Crisis is still visible today. The Middle East, which had been dominated by European powers for centuries, was now an American sphere of influence. The oil fields of Saudi Arabia, the military bases in the Persian Gulf, the alliances with Israel. All of this was built on the ruins of British and French imperial power. The United States stepped into the vacuum left by the collapse of the old empires and created its own informal empire, an empire not of colonies, but of client states, military alliances, and economic dependency. For Egypt, the victory was bittersweet. Nasser had won his battle with the colonial powers, but he did not create the prosperous, independent Egypt he had dreamed of. The Aswan Dam was built with Soviet money after the West abandoned the project. Egypt fell into the orbit of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, becoming dependent on a different superpower. The canal remained a source of conflict. It was closed again during the Six-Day War in 1967 and remained shut for 8 years, crippling Egypt's economy. Today, the Suez Canal is once again a vital international waterway, but the revenues still do not transform Egypt into a wealthy nation. The canal is profitable, but the country remains poor, plagued by corruption, authoritarianism, and economic stagnation. The British, meanwhile, never recovered their former glory. The Suez Crisis accelerated the decolonization process. The colonies in Africa and Asia, seeing that Britain could no longer defend even its most vital interests, demanded independence with renewed urgency. Within a decade, the British Empire had dissolved almost entirely. The Royal Navy shrank. The global network of military bases was abandoned. Britain became a middle-sized power, dependent on the United States for its security and its economic stability. There is a painful irony in the Suez story. Britain had spent the 19th century using financial coercion to dominate weaker nations. The opium trade with China, the sterling balances in India, the debt traps imposed on Egypt and Latin America. Britain had perfected the art of economic warfare, but in 1956, the tables were turned. Britain became the victim of the very tactics it had once used to control the world. The Americans did to Britain what Britain had done to so many others. They used financial power to force political submission. It was poetic justice, though the British did not see it that way. The Suez Crisis also destroyed the last illusion of European unity and strength. Britain and France had invaded Egypt together, hoping that their combined power would be enough to defy the United States. But when the financial pressure came, the alliance crumbled. The French were furious that the British withdrew first, leaving them isolated. The bitterness from Suez contributed to France's decision to pursue an independent foreign policy under Charles de Gaulle. France developed its own nuclear weapons, withdrew from NATO's military command, and refused to follow American leadership. The Europeans learned that they could not trust each other, and they certainly could not trust the Americans. The Suez Crisis teaches us a dark lesson about the nature of power in the modern world. The empires of the past were built on military conquest. They were built on the ability to sail a fleet of warships to a foreign coast and impose your will at gunpoint. But the American empire was different. It was built on financial control. The United States did not need to occupy Egypt to control its destiny. It did not need to station soldiers in London to dictate British policy. All it needed was control over the currency, the credit, and the markets, and with that control, it could make any nation bend to its will. This is the world we still live in today. When the United States wants to punish a country, it does not invade. It imposes sanctions. It freezes assets. It cuts off access to the dollar system. It weaponizes the financial infrastructure that it built in the decades after World War II. Countries like Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and countless others have learned the same lesson that Britain learned in 1956. If you defy the United States, you will not face a military invasion. You will face economic strangulation. And for most countries, that is far more devastating. The image of British paratroopers landing on the beaches of Port Said in November 1956 is a picture that has been carefully erased from the British national memory. You will not see it celebrated in the war museums of London. You will not find it in the heroic narratives of British history. It is an embarrassment, a reminder of the day that Britain tried to act like an empire and was slapped down like a disobedient child. But for the rest of the world, particularly the countries of the global south, the Suez Crisis is remembered as a turning point. It was the moment when the old colonial powers were finally humbled. It was the moment when the people of Egypt and the broader Arab world saw that the British lion had no teeth, but they also saw that one empire had simply been replaced by another. The British were gone, but the Americans had taken their place. The Suez Canal, which had been built by Egyptian labor and Egyptian money, was still a tool of foreign powers. It was still a strategic asset that the great powers would fight over, manipulate, and control. The names had changed,